Welcome to Calm Historian. Today, March 16th, 2025, we're gently stepping into the Middle Ages to see how people truly got married, from hearthside hand fastings to church blessings and bustling village feasts. Before we begin, please share in the comments where you're watching from and your current local time. Settle in, and if this quiet journey through the past resonates with you, please like and consider subscribing. Imagine a world where the joining of two people was never just a private promise between lovers, but a visible weaving together of households, fortunes, and futures. In the narrow lanes and wide commons of a medieval town or manor, marriage was a bargain struck across kitchen tables and over ale-stained ledgers. Parents were negotiators and matchmakers by instinct and necessity. A mother could tell you the value of her daughter's dowry as surely as she knew the size of her linen chest. A father measured the worth of an alliance the way he measured fields at harvest. Conversations about marriage hummed in parlors, echoed through the guild hall, and were sealed with a nod over a loaf of bread. No one in a household overlooked the match's importance. This was how land stayed intact, debts were settled, loyalties strengthened, and the next generation positioned. Legally, medieval marriage had a surprisingly spare skeleton. In the eyes of church and custom, the single crucial element was consent. If two people freely declared their intention to be husband and wife, that mutual assent carried weight. That simple fact shifted the meaning of the ceremony. Marriage was not solely an ecclesiastical mystery performed by a priest, but an agreement born from words spoken between two people. Yet that private promise had to be made visible. Bells had to ring. Names had to be called, banns read aloud. The community was summoned to witness, to remember, to attest that there were no legal impediments, no earlier vows, no hidden claims that might undo the union. Making the match public was both a shield against scandal and a way to fold the couple into village life. When the day arrived, weddings could be bright and raucous rather than hushed and solemn. They spilled into yards and onto village greens, and drew the whole parish to the churchyard. Musicians tuned fiddles and pipes while children darted about with ribbons. Neighbors arrived bearing pies and flagons to share. Vows might be pledged at the church threshold or beneath an open sky. Sunlight or candlelight blessing faces turned toward the couple. There was singing and dancing, the clink of mugs, and the visible generosity of food and drink. As much a celebration of a new household as of the union itself. Tokens were exchanged, hands were clasped, and the community gave its approval with cheers and the unmistakable mise-en-scène of ordinary folk welcoming a new alliance. All the bustle and formality masked a quieter human truth. Love found its place here in many forms. For some, affection grew slowly out of shared work and shared burdens, a warmth kindled by common tasks at the hearth, by mending nets or turning loaves together. Others lived with the dream of courtly love, those tales sung by troubadours and minstrels, a private longing that did not always match the marriage negotiated by kin. Sometimes marriages became partnerships of affection and respect. Other times they were compromises that left one or both partners yearning for something different. Even so, the mutual consent that established a marriage also opened the possibility that two lives could learn to lean on one another, turning obligation into tenderness. The ceremony itself could be theatrical and immediate. Picture the hush of negotiation giving way to a loud day of vows. Parents' hands withdrawing as the couple speaks for themselves. Neighbors stepping forward to throw coins or to clap. A bride or groom looking out, perhaps with nerves or hope, into a sea of familiar faces. Bells and bands had done their work by then. The whole community stood as witness. That public dimension was practical as much as symbolic. It checked for previous commitments, it kept secret claims at bay, and it made the couple's pledge part of the community record. Every detail carried meaning. A candle's flicker might mark the boundary between old life and new. The glint of tossed coins said, "Welcome and wager at once." Tokens exchanged were small acts loaded with promise. A piece of cloth, a ring, a purse. Hands clasped in front of friends and kin sealed social as well as personal bonds. The music, the food, the laughter, and the chatter, all of it folded the marriage into the village's ongoing story, so that the household being formed would be known, supported, and held accountable by neighbors. In a culture where family lines mattered as much as names, marriage was at once economic and communal, practical and festive, binding and human. It was business, certainly, but it was also a beginning. In those beginnings lingered every possibility that sustains a life together: alliance, protection, the slow growth of feeling, and the building of a shared home. From the hush of negotiation to the noise of celebration, medieval marriages were where duty and desire met, and where, sometimes against the odds, companionship bloomed from the bargain. Imagine a village street on a damp morning in the Middle Ages. Smoke from hearth fires curls toward a low gray sky, and the air tastes faintly of peat and wet straw. People move between courtyards and thatched doorways not simply to trade or gossip, but to set the course of other lives. Here, marriage is not a sudden joining of two hearts in private. It is a deliberate stitch in the fabric of family and fortune. Parents sit together with measured faces, weighing kinship, loyalty, and livelihood as carefully as they would a load of grain. They choose partners to secure alliances, to bind neighbors or distant relatives into mutual obligation, to protect land and property, and to make sure a household will continue. The bride and groom, often young, sometimes barely more than acquaintances, become the human hinge on which these wider interests turn. Their wishes might be considered, but more often they are folded into the practical necessities of family strategy. At the center of these arrangements is the dowry, not merely a trunk of goods, but a promise made visible. A dowry is the parcel, the sum, the provision that travels with a bride into her new life. For many families, it is a matter of survival as well as status. A well-provided dowry offers a shield for the woman leaving her childhood home. It can mean the difference between security and precarity in a foreign household. For the man who receives it, and for the household that gains it, the dowry is a reinforcement of standing in the village, a sign that this home has means and connections. Fathers measure what they will pledge with anxious pride. Mothers count what must be given and what must be kept back in case of sickness or old age. The exchange is both negotiation and oath, an agreement in goods and vows that binds two households as surely as any spoken covenant. Law and custom lay their own rhythms over these private plans. A lawful marriage could not be stitched in secret. It required the couple's mutual consent, and it required publicity. The parish church was the civic stage for this publicity. Before rings were exchanged or hearths combined, the banns were proclaimed aloud on successive Sundays. Names were called, intention declared, and the whole community was given time to speak if an impediment, some canonical tie, a hidden promise, or an unsettled debt, might make the match impossible. Those public announcements were not mere ceremony. They were a safeguard, a way of unearthing concealed ties or old claims that could unravel a match if left hidden. In the minutes before the altar, truth might surface and plans be halted, revised, or confirmed. The marriage itself often had a clear shape and a surprising intimacy in its formality. Many of the crucial words and pledges were spoken at the very threshold of the church, standing where the sacred house met the world outside. There, in full view of priest and parishioner, the couple acknowledged their union. The brief moment at the door marked the transition from one household to another. Behind them, the church stood silent and solemn. Ahead of them waited the noise of communal life. That spoken consent at the doorway was followed by an outpouring of neighbors and festivities. Music, long trestle tables piled with food, and the rattling of plates and tankards as people celebrated. Weddings were public festivals as much as legal acts. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the smoke of torches. Children darted between legs, stealing a crust or two. Neighbors brought pies and ale, eager to take part. Laughter and song filled the air as relations and acquaintances shared in marking the new bond. These gatherings did something the paperwork could not. They turned a legal agreement into a lived reality. By eating at the same table and bearing witness to vows, the community authenticated the match and made the new household a visible part of village life. Courtship before marriage was far from the private, romantic wandering of later stories. It was usually formal, watched and guided by family. Conversations were cautious, walks were escorted, and meetings often took place with elders or trusted kin present. This supervision was not only about control, it was about protection, preserving honor, keeping reputations intact, and allowing neighbors to testify to the character and fitness of those being joined. Within those limits, a couple might discover one another's habits and temper, and over time genuine affection could grow. But they were expected to understand that marriage meant more than companionship. It meant stepping into clearly defined roles and responsibilities for the household's work and survival. When the union was complete, it did more than join two people. It remade family itself. A new household formed, bringing new duties, loyalties, and obligations to the wider kin network. The bride left behind the daily rhythms of her natal home to join another's patterns of work, expectation, and authority. The groom took on duties for shelter and sustenance. Together they began the slow, practical labor of running a household, organizing work, allocating resources, bearing and raising children, and honoring the agreements that had brought them together. In this way, marriage functioned as a social engine, securing alliances, reinforcing economic stability, and shaping community life. So when you picture marriage in the Middle Ages, set aside the image of secret whispers in moonlit gardens. Think instead of busy hearths and the low, serious conversations of families. Picture the proclamation of bans on the parish steps, the careful negotiation of dowries by anxious parents, the solemn consent spoken at the church door, and the roar of a village feast that follows. Remember, too, that beneath the formal arrangements and the watchful elders, there could be tenderness and resilience, a slow, durable companionship that grew out of shared work and mutual obligation. Those unions, negotiated, announced, and celebrated, were the scaffolding of medieval society, binding people together in ways that were practical, public, and deeply consequential. It might sound like a medieval dating service, but the deal was never about romance. Marriages were negotiations in which parents tried to secure power, wealth, and land. They would peer at a potential match as if reading a ledger, calculating how a single union could stitch two houses together and make both stronger. Parental consent was not a courtesy, it was the whole point. A nod across a table, a signature on a contract. Those were the instruments that turned a proposal into a promise. Your opinion mattered on paper and in principle, and sometimes in those rare private moments when a father's hand loosened and a mother's eyes softened. But more often your wishes were smoothed by older hands until they fit the family's needs. If you were a woman, the world quietly narrowed. Conversations that once belonged to you were redirected into corners where other people traded them, measured them, and folded them into plans. You learned to read the small signs, the tightened jaw at dinner, the furtive meeting in the study, the ledger left open on the table like a map to an arranged future. Those little gestures became your language, and you learned to carry your own wishes like a secret under your tongue. When the arrangements were set, it felt like both a closing and an opening. One evening, your father might speak of acres, alliances, debts repaid or strengthened. The next, a man you had never met would be given the shape of husband by a contract and a handshake. You stood in the middle of those decisions as if you were a quiet marking on a page, necessary, present, but small in the margins of a story written by generations before you. There was grief in losing a chosen path, a sadness for doors you had not opened yourself. Yet there was also a steady sort of acceptance. Families survived by weaving themselves into larger cloth, and you were taught that loyalty and duty were the threads that held everything together. In the hush after the bargain, as candles guttered and the house settled, you felt both the weight and the strength of those invisible stitches. Dowries were a big deal in medieval life, more than a simple wedding gift. They were a financial boost that sealed the deal and a way for families to protect or even improve their place in society. Marriage mattered not just to two people, but to whole households and to the community at large. It shaped alliances, property, and the social order itself. Picture a town square under a slate sky, the church bell murmuring its patient time. In a quiet house just off the lane, a family gathers around a long table. They are not talking about a party. They are arranging a future. When a bride's family prepared a dowry, they were doing far more than tucking coins into a chest. They were building a safety net, a promise of security for the woman whose life and fortunes were about to be joined with another's. Imagine the slow care with which linens are folded, the soft clink of small coins counted into a pouch, the marking of a cow's token, or the careful recording of a parcel of land. These things traveled with the bride as both symbol and substance, bedding for warmth, money for grain, livestock for livelihood, land that could feed a household. The dowry was comfort in a new home and a guarantee that she would not be left destitute if fate turned against her husband or the marriage frayed. Neighbors would whisper about the size of the gift, not idle gossip, but a way to measure social standing and the seriousness of the match. Fathers and mothers thought in practical, sometimes wary terms. What if illness visited the husband? What if quarrels split the household? What if she were blamed and cast out? The dowry answered those questions with material weight. It represented a family's hopes, its anxieties, and its obligation to protect a daughter's future. This was both a private act of care and a public arrangement. Passed into a marriage, the dowry could give a woman a measure of independence within the bonds of matrimony, a stake that could secure warmth, bread, shelter, and crucially, a continued voice in the world. In the bright glare of the ceremony, the dowry was often overlooked. But beneath that veil, it was the quiet, indispensable safety net on which many medieval lives depended. Imagine a mother stepping back, a father murmuring, "You'll be safe," as their daughter moves toward a new life. In that moment, a dowry mattered as much as a blessing, a material promise that could change a family's standing and secure a young woman's place. These gifts shaped matrimonial contracts and bolstered a groom's status, functioning in their own way like a medieval version of leveling up. The little stone church sat low on the hill, its single bell a patient voice calling people from field and market. Inside, light from a high, narrow window sliced a pale bar across the worn benches, and the air held the faint smoke of hearths and the honeyed sweetness of beeswax. Around the altar, two families congregated, cloaks rumpled from the road, hands full of small, meaningful things, a folded piece of cloth, a coin tucked in a scrap of leather, a parcel wrapped in oilskin. These outward tokens were simple, but when placed in the quiet of the nave, they spoke of promises much deeper than fabric or metal. This was a world ruled by kinship and obligation, where your place was defined by the ties you kept and the people who vouched for you. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council took a decisive step that would reach right into these moments. Its rulings began to shape how marriage, dowries, and obligations were understood across Christendom. What had once been flexible local custom started to gain steadier form. Rites became more regular, expectations clearer, and the exchanges surrounding betrothal and wedding were drawn into a common pattern. For the young woman standing before the altar, the dowry was more than goods or coin. It was a folded promise. It said she belonged to a household, that she would not be cast adrift when storms came, and that her children would have claim and place. For her father, it was a bundle of pride, grief, and practical care, a last material expression of responsibility and a hedge against life's unpredictability. For the groom, it was recognition and obligation alike, a rightful tie to a new family, a gift that also set duties in motion. Priests and elders, guided by the church's growing rules, moved through the ceremony with an eye toward order and fairness. The community watched and registered what was done. Neighbors and kin became witnesses and guarantors. By formalizing these practices, the church did more than regulate transactions. It helped bind individuals into households, and households into a wider social fabric. Marriage was no longer only a private joining, but a public certainty, a promise of belonging and continuity. Under the dim light of that hilltop church, the exchange of cloth and coin echoed with something far larger than the objects themselves. Each parcel tied a person to a place, wove families together, and offered a kind of shelter in a world that could be unpredictable and harsh. When the bell rang again and the doors opened to daylight and dust, those ties, acknowledged and witnessed, were the assurance that no one would be left outside the circle when the winds came. The dowry wasn't inheritable by children, but it carried a different kind of inheritance, the promise of a woman's security. It moved with her into a new household, a bundle of linens, coins, small plots of land or silver plate that was meant to keep her from ending up destitute if fortune turned. In a world where sickness, childbirth, and war could change everything overnight, this chest of goods was less romance than practical foresight, an insurance policy sealed in cloth and metal. When families met to arrange a marriage, the vows everyone remembers were only the visible part of a far more complex business. Behind the quiet ceremony, there were ledgers and parchments, witnesses and seals, negotiations held in parlors and priors' houses by men whose language was largely that of property and protection. You can picture the scene: a scribe dipping his pen by candlelight, the scratch of iron on parchment, a neighbor's name scratched into a margin. The dowry was packed with as much care as the bride's trousseau. It was meant to travel with her, to anchor her place in a new home, and to reassure both families that she would be provided for. Those parcels and balances could be invoked by law. In small manorial courts and in the hushed chambers of bishops, dowries turned into evidence and into obligations. Parchment spelled out what should happen if a marriage broke down, if the husband died leaving no children, or if a woman was repudiated. Witnesses lent weight to promises. Seals guaranteed identity. Church courts, which cared for moral and spiritual order, also lived in this practical world, adjudicating disputes about dowries, enforcing settlements, and weighing claims of fraud or coercion. The outcome of such hearings might be the difference between comfortable living and real poverty. Legal frameworks varied by place, but a common thread ran through them. Marriage was as much a social and economic contract as a private union of two people. Canon law shaped much of the landscape. It set rules about consent and capacity, and in practice it commonly treated a girl as able to marry at 12 and a boy at 14. Those ages were not just numbers. A betrothal between minors could bind families, and a consummated union could make a marriage terribly difficult to set aside. Age became a hinge on which future security and reputation turned. Alongside the dowry existed the dower, a separate but related provision, where the dowry was the bride's contribution, her chest, her money, her portable goods. The dower was the safety net provided by the husband's family or by law. Often it amounted to a portion of the husband's lands, sometimes as much as a third, reserved to support a wife if she became a widow. Between dowry and dower, families tried to manage risk in a harsh world where support could vanish overnight. Contracts took care to list contingencies: who would keep the goods if a marriage failed, what rights a widow might have, and how to proceed in cases of repudiation. These were worked out on paper, signed and sealed, but they reflected very human anxieties. Parents smoothing linen in a cold stone house, a father pacing while the scribe writes, a mother tucking handkerchiefs into a chest. These were scenes of hope and calculation both. At the center of all this was the person whose future the documents tried to secure. For the bride, the dowry was not only property, it was a symbol of respect and a measure of independence in a new household. To the bishop who signed a consent or the scribe who copied a clause, it might be legal language, but to the families it was a lifeline. In ink and cloth and coin, the dowry was written to protect a woman's future in a world where protection was never guaranteed. Now let's get into the legal stuff, because even in the Middle Ages they loved their rules. The age for marriage was surprisingly young. Girls could marry at 12, boys at 14. Crazy, right? Back then, a marriage could happen in the space of a single breath. Two people might meet in a kitchen doorway, on the edge of a field, beneath a church eave, or by a hearth still warm with supper. A look, a reaching hand, a voice that trembled but was steady enough to be heard. And that was often all it took. They didn't need witnesses in grand robes or a ledger entry to make it real. With one unmistakable word, they gave themselves to each other. That yes carried a force that no amount of shouting from relatives or scolding from a clergyman could undo. In that instant, one life folded into another, and by the power of law, as much as by feeling, they were married. Imagine the relief and the terror pressed together in that moment. The young woman whose mother had hoped for a different match. The young man who knew his father would scowl until the English rain returned. Each felt the world tilt under the gravity of consent. Traditions and ceremonies could be bypassed. A whispered vow in a dim lane or a promise shouted in a busy market carried the same effect as any priest's blessing. The village and its people learned to reckon with unions sealed privately, and the couple themselves suddenly faced the solidity of rights and responsibilities that arrived with their mutual assent. There was something elemental about it, as if the law simply nodded to a first human promise. Love, necessity, defiance. Any motive could lie behind that simple yes. However it began, that single word was enough to change names, lives, and futures. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council stepped into the private lives of ordinary people and tried to change how they promised each other a future. Its decree was simple and public. Marriages should be publicly announced, not whispered in secret. The intention was to stop surprises and to make unions clear to church and community alike. But old habits were stubborn. In kitchens lit by a lone guttering candle, on the threshing floor at dusk, along hedgerows after market, lovers still pledged themselves in low, urgent voices. No priest stood beside them. No parish register recorded the moment. Those vows were practical and immediate, a response to a pregnancy, a promise against separation, a desperate clinging to a fear of loss. They were trusted more than signed papers, held in memory and habit rather than ink. Such private agreements, however sincere, were vulnerable. A phrase spoken once could shift in the ears of the listener the next day. A hurried word at a fair, a whisper in a field, a neighbor's muddled account could swell into something one person called marriage and another later denied. Rumors spread through lanes and porches, reputations wobbled, and families watched one another with suspicion as loyalty and shame braided together. When these uncertainties hardened into conflict, the village had only the courts. Small hearing rooms filled with people in plain clothes, a mother with a shawl wrapped tight, a man whose jaw wouldn't relax. Witnesses tumbled over one another to reconstruct nights edged in dim light. Clerks rifled through letters and scraps of evidence. Elders were summoned to remember who stood where and what was said months before. The formal needs of the law, signatures, witnesses, clear proof, bumped up against human memory and desire, and the result was often messy and painfully real. These trials were far from abstract. They decided who would be publicly acknowledged, who would inherit, who would raise children, and who would carry the stain of scandal. In the hush of the courtroom, the most intimate moments were reduced to questions and cross-examination, the raw confusion of two lives translated into legal language and procedure. Yet the old customs never fully vanished at the courthouse door. They re-emerged in testimony, the halting account of promises made under imperfect light, and in the slow, weighty judgments that tried to put a final name to who was married to whom. Imagine a bright morning in a medieval town or beneath the high beams of a manor hall, where the air tastes of baking bread and the scent of thyme and rosemary follows every footstep. Word of a marriage spreads like a ribbon unrolling, not just between two families, but through the whole community. A wedding in the Middle Ages is never merely a private promise. It stitches households together, seals alliances, and sets the course of inheritance for generations. From the hush of prayer in the church to the clamor of horns and laughter at the feast, every detail carries meaning. Long before the bells call people to the nave, the marriage has already been shaped by conversation and calculation. Fathers and mothers, kin and in-laws meet in dimly lit solar rooms or beneath tapestries to negotiate dowries and terms that protect property and clarify obligations. These agreements can be quick-spoken vows in the village square or careful written contracts that inventory land and goods. What sounds cold to modern ears was then understood as securing the family's future. Wealth, rights, and responsibilities passing from one generation to the next. At the heart of those papers and bargains, however, lies the human choice, the pledge of consent, witnessed by the community so promises can be held to account. On the morning of the wedding, preparation itself becomes ritual. Women braid hair, pin veils, and weave garlands of flowers or herbs into crowns to perfume and protect the bride. These garlands are more than decoration. They are signs of health, fertility, and social standing. The bride's dress is the finest cloth the family can afford. Color follows local custom rather than a modern rule. Jewel tones, dyed silks, and sturdy wool all show rank and thrift. Men adjust cloaks, brighten belts, and check the polish on the simple tokens they will give. Sometimes a ring, sometimes a small piece of metal or cloth. These rings and tokens serve as visible seals of what is spoken aloud, tangible promises you can hold up and show. The ceremony itself moves in a procession that unrolls like a living tapestry. Torches or rushlights flicker in stone churches. Bells call the faithful together. Neighbors and relatives line the nave to make the private vow into public law. The priest leads prayers, asking God's blessing, but the most important moment remains the mutual giving of consent. The couple declares their troth, solemn words promising fidelity, and their hands are joined. Sometimes the priest slips a ring on a finger, sometimes witnesses clasp hands and pledge their recognition. In these acts, the spiritual and the legal meet. Marriage is both sacrament and contract, bound by faith and confirmed by the village's site. In many places, the service continues with a mass, the bread and wine of the Eucharist folding the couple into the life of the church and making the union sacred as well as social. Parts of the liturgy change from region to region. Chants and readings may be sung in Latin or in the local tongue. Local saints' days add color, and rituals like the washing of hands or the placing of a candle connect the newlyweds to the cycle of seasons and souls. Community prayers and blessings for fertility thread the ceremony into the wider world, turning personal vows into a pledge under heaven. When the formal rite ends, solemnity gives way to celebration. The procession often leads toward the bride's new home, a manor or household that will be her stage and the site of future labor and joy. In the hall, long tables groan under roasted meats, pies, and spiced wine. Minstrels make the rafters ring. Fiddles, lutes, and pipes lift music that sends bodies to the floor. Guests bring gifts, linens, livestock, plates of salted fish, practical offerings to stock the new household. Food and drink are more than pleasure. They are public generosity, a way of setting the marriage into communal memory. Certain customs add spice and edge to the evening. Some communities take part in placing the bridal bed, a ritual that makes consummation a communal expectation and the proof of the marriage's completion. Elsewhere, neighbors offer a braying, joking chorus to welcome the couple and test their readiness for village life. Folk rites and dances mingle with formal entertainments, masked performances, acrobats, and dramatic recitations that tie the couple's fate to larger stories of love, luck, and fortune. The bride's first night carries heavy meaning. Consummation makes the marriage complete in the eyes of law and church. Children born within the union inherit rights and status, and the seal of the marital bed affirms the social contract already declared by vows and gifts. That private and consequential ceremony closes the arc that began with public pledges earlier in the day, moving the wedding from proclamation to permanence. Across regions, there is wide variety in how these moments are shaped. In Celtic or Norse-influenced areas, a hand fasting, a public joining of hands, can serve as a binding promise. Towns sometimes involve guilds or civic authorities when marriages affect property or civic rights. Noble courts stage extravagant affairs with banners, heralds, knights, and troubadours, while peasant weddings keep the same basic elements: promise, witness, blessing, feasting, dressed in what is available. Over the centuries, the church moves to regulate and formalize practices, insisting on public proclamation and clergy, so secret unions become harder to claim. Still, law and ceremony never fully drown out the human heart. When the last cup is drained and the candles gutter low, what remains is a changed landscape of obligations and possibilities. A medieval marriage is not merely two people pledging love. It is a knot tied between households, a rearrangement of work and wealth, an event that ripples through village fields and manor ledgers alike. Yet beneath the contracts and ceremonies there is laughter, nervous fingers twisting linen, and a small, fierce hope that two people, adored, argued over, blessed, and watched, will build a life together. That blend of the sacred and the everyday, of law and song, turns every wedding into a vivid passage through which communities renew themselves, season after season. Picture this. The wedding takes place right outside the church door, a small ceremony that feels larger simply because it's open to everyone. It's a public affair. The bride and groom stand together with the bride on the left, facing the church door. Bells spill across the village that morning, a silver sound that gathers people as effortlessly as sunlight gathers dust motes, and the stone steps and worn thresholds become a kind of stage. On such mornings, the church is more than a building. It is a town square, a confessional, a place where private promises are set before a watching world. Before any knot is tied or vows are breathed beneath candlelight, there is the ritual of announcement, the banns. Spoken aloud from the pulpit, often on 3 successive Sundays, these proclamations lay the intention bare. They name the couple and ask everyone present to listen and to remember. The point is practical and moral at once. If anyone knows of a lawful objection, if some hidden impediment or secret claim would make the union unjust, this is the moment to speak. In making the marriage public, the banns make neighbors into guardians of the bond. There is a hush that attends those words, a communal holding of breath. Mothers smooth skirts, old men lean forward, friends glance at one another to see what the other sees. The procession that follows is less about spectacle than about assurance. Eyes are witnesses, tongues the bankkeepers of truth. In that attention, the couple is steadied. The village is quietly asked to approve, and if necessary, to object. Witnessing becomes a kind of settlement, a way of turning private desire into something the community can verify. When the groom steps forward, he carries an ancient economy of meaning. He offers what used to be called a wed, a pledge, a small tangible sign of his consent. It is not mere ornament, but a promise shaped into an object, meant to make private assent visible and to reassure the woman he seeks to join. In the simple gesture of giving it hand to hand, something shifts. Hesitation becomes decision. Rumor is checked by reality, and two lives begin to take on a public face. There are many ways to speak of such rites: legal, pastoral, procedural. Yet standing among the parishioners, you feel their human purpose plainly. The bands and the wed together knit individual intention to communal trust. They make consent audible and traceable, affection legible to a household and to a parish. Amid the scent of wax and the murmur of prayers, the community witnesses not only an exchange of hearts, but the start of a shared obligation. Those simple ancient gestures transform a private vow into something the whole village can hold to be true. As the ceremony unfolds, the priest pauses and asks whether anyone objects, and then the couple exchange their religious vows. The words are solemn and old, the kind that settle into the bones of a place. The bride often wears a ring on her right hand, a bright, simple circle to mark the turning of her life towards something new. When the vows and the formalities at last fall away, the mood in the hall brightens as if someone has thrown open a window. Platters appear, steaming and heavy, and the air fills with the warm, comforting smells of roasted meat and spiced bread. Tankards are raised, silverware clinks, and a ribbon of candlelight shivers down the length of the long table. Musicians take their places, fiddles and pipes, perhaps a small drum, and the first lively tune chases out any last trace of ceremony. Feet begin to tap, then to move. Couples find each other, hands join, and soon the room is a whirl of skirts and laughter, the rough happiness of people who have been let loose to celebrate. Amid the music and dancing, another, more peculiar custom unfolds. The guests, full of good-natured bawdiness, gather around the newlyweds and, with teasing nudges and knowing smiles, shepherd them away from the bright company toward the privacy they are expected to claim. It is a jocular, insistently intimate ritual. Friends and relatives who stood at their side during the vows now press gently forward to make sure the promise is completed in every sense. Sometimes the teasing becomes physical. Fingers dart, someone lifts, as if to mark the moment. And in some places, the tradition goes so far as to peel back the bride's garter, waving it like a small trophy of the night. There is embarrassment, certainly. A sudden flush on the bride's cheek, a bashful grin from the groom. But it is mingled with approval and a kind of rough blessing. The procession, the laughter, the slight scandal of the garter being slipped free all serve to turn what might have remained private into an endnote of communal joy, a closing gesture that seals what has been promised, first witnessed by family, and then, in a different way, by the whole noisy company. What a day! Imagine a world before the church stepped into marriage, small villages where unions were made outdoors, by the roadside, in the market square. A man and a woman would promise to build a life together, their words held up by neighbors and sealed by custom rather than ceremony. Family, kin, and the practical arrangements of land, dowry, and labor shaped the union that followed. There was a kind of solidity in those promises, rough-edged, practical, rooted in everyday needs, but also a bluntness. Marriage was as much a social contract, negotiated and enforced by families and watchful relatives, as it was an expression of feeling. Then, slowly, the church began to press its quiet authority into that private space. Where once a clasped hand or a spoken pledge might be enough, people started to feel the hush of a nave, the splash of colored light through stained glass, the low murmur of a priest preparing a blessing. Ritual moved inward, from public custom to sacred rite. The presence of a man of God lifting a blessing over two people changed the tone. Vows spoken in the church were heard not just by neighbors, but by God. That shift gave new weight to fidelity and duty, and it reshaped how people thought about the consequences of breaking a bond. The change touched daily life as much as ceremony. Church language and symbols began to frame marriage as something that mattered for the soul as well as for inheritance and work. Villages learned to look to the church calendar and its teachings. Couples who once relied only on family arrangements found both reassurance and new obligations in a priest's blessing. What had been a handshake deal grew solemn and visible, and in that transformation, expectations, responsibilities, and the very texture of intimate life were reshaped. Quiet vows under rafters, new rules for kin and neighbors, and a sense that marriage was now a bond with earthly effects and spiritual meaning. In 1215, something quiet and enormous happened. The Fourth Lateran Council declared marriage a sacrament. That one ruling changed how people joined their lives. No longer a private bargain, marriage now had a sacred weight. A priest would stand witness. Vows became not just promises between two people, but something solemn and legally binding. Secret weddings were discouraged. Instead, the church required public announcements, the banns, called out in advance so neighbors would know and any objections could be raised. It was a move that wove individual unions into the fabric of the wider community. Picture the village shaped by slow, patient hands, thatched roofs, a lane polished by cartwheels, smoke curling from chimneys into a pale sky. The church steeple rises among the low houses like a small, steady mountain. When the bell begins to toll, it does more than tell time. It calls the town to attention. The sound blooms round and bronze, spilling over fields and slipping through shutters. It hangs in the air like a promise. As the toll continues, life shifts. A man at his forge pauses, hammer poised, listening as if the note could steady the metal in his hand. A woman at the well straightens, her bucket forgotten. Children freeze mid-chase and press their noses to the hedgerow. From the baker's oven to the seamstress's needle, everyday tasks soften and faces lift. Curiosity becomes movement, curtains part, a gate creaks, feet come down the lane. First a few heads at windows, then a trickle of familiar faces, until a small crowd gathers, bringing with them the warmth and memory of this place. There is laughter, quiet blessing, the rustle of skirts, the creak of wooden shoes on packed earth. Old friends who remember your childhood, neighbors who only nod in passing, all converge. Their presence steadies the nerves, inflates the joy. What begins as a private pledge is made public and kept by the village, retold in stories, watered by gossip, honored with small everyday kindnesses. In that bell's long note, two lives are folded into something larger, a shared life held not just by law or church, but by the people who will carry the promise forward. The church's task was simple to say and heavy to carry. Make sure marriages were solid and sacred. When love ran ahead of the rules, when a girl's belly quickened or gossip whispered of a stolen tryst, the church stepped in to steady the course, to keep families, property, and reputations from unraveling. It did not do this all at once. Bit by bit, it turned private bargains into public sacrament, and then set about building the fences that would hold that new order together. Where once a token or a whispered vow might have bound two households, now there were lists, categories, and questions to be answered before the bells could legally ring. The change was a long tightening. New rites, new words read aloud, new papers to sign and file. Imagine a parish house at dawn, the chill in the air, an anxious couple exchanging glances while their kin measure one another with old suspicions. Across town, a priest bent over a worn register by candlelight, the page edges dark with years of ink and fingers. Outside, the church tower kept time in patient tolling. Inside, a new language of rules was being inscribed. The prohibitions read like a map of dangers. Certain degrees of blood kinship were simply forbidden. Marriages that centuries earlier might have seemed natural now became unthinkable. Spiritual ties made at the baptismal font or in the secrecy of confession could bar someone as surely as blood. Past vows or orders taken in the name of God could blot out future hopes of a household. Clandestine matches were outlawed. A secret word in the wood no longer sufficed. From then on, marriages had to be witnessed, announced, and recorded.
Polygamy, or the casual reassembly of households after death or dispute, was forbidden. The whole village, not just the two families involved, was enlisted as guardian of the right. When a marriage failed, the church did not offer divorce in the modern sense, but a different remedy: annulment, a formal inquiry into whether a true marital bond had ever existed. These proceedings were not mere paperwork. They were intimate, searching investigations into consent and capacity, into intention and the absence of it. Tribunals asked whether coercion or deceit had marred a promise, whether impotence or an earlier commitment had rendered a union impossible. Quiet rooms hosted solemn hearings where witnesses were called, confidences were recorded, and the air held the weight of private lives being examined. At the end, a judge or bishop delivered a single verdict. The bond stood, or it had been null from the beginning. The consequences of those decisions were anything but abstract. A decree of invalidation could restore a woman's honor or strip a child's claim to legitimacy. A denied dispensation could keep property in place but shatter a hopeful pair. The church presented these measures as guardianship, protecting the sanctity of the sacrament, keeping inheritance and property from chaotic upheaval, caring for souls as much as bodies. The rituals, the parchments, the tribunal rooms, and stamped seals gave the new system its teeth and kept families in a rough order that everyone could understand. So marriage itself was remade. What had once been a flexible private pact became public law, governed by doctrine, witnessed by robed men, and recorded in ink for posterity. Behind every prohibition, every petition for a dispensation, and every annulment, there were names and stories, fear and relief, anger and quiet vindication, all played out beneath the careful, unblinking eye of a church that had rewritten the rules of love. Getting married in the Middle Ages was never only about two people promising a life together. It was threaded through with the church's rules. Some of those rules were blunt and public. Consanguinity, for example, meant you couldn't marry a cousin without courting trouble. And others were absolute. Anyone who had taken permanent religious vows was simply not free to wed. When a marriage came apart, people did not always speak of divorce. The church offered annulment, a kind of do-over, a legal way to say that what everyone had called a marriage had never fully been what it claimed to be. Those who crossed the threshold of the ecclesiastical court carried a bundle of complaints that could unwind the strongest vows. Some were whispered like marketplace scandal: adultery, the betrayal of beds and promises, an injury to honor that a few apologies could not mend. Some were darker still: rape, a violence that stripped a union of consent and left families reeling with shame and anger. There were also quieter, terrible proofs: impotence, the intimate failure that turned private bodies into public evidence that a union had never achieved its deepest purpose. Picture the scenes: a woman in threadbare sleeves clutching a petition, her fingers raw from too many prayers and too few comforts; a man whose jaw tightens as neighbors avert their eyes, balancing on a knife edge between shame and defiance; a priest in a candlelit room, weighing testimony against custom, memory against the law. The language of annulment let communities say that certain bonds should never have been recognized as binding, that breaches of body, faith, or duty could undo a contract once celebrated with bread and vows. It wasn't only acts of the flesh that could rend a marriage. The church watched for ties spun from the spiritual life. The invisible threads between God-parent and God-child, a bond marked in baptism and carried through rites and promises, could become a legal barrier to marriage. Spiritual kinship carried its own intimacy and obligations. People believed these relations placed two souls too close for a conjugal union. When such a link was found, it could be raised as a reason to declare a marriage void, as if the very pattern of souls and vows had been sown wrongly from the start. So annulment acquired many textures: relief for some, ruin for others, vindication and accusation braided together. In hushed courts and sunlit parish rooms, amid the rustle of papers,
and the faint smell of incense, people sought these do-overs for reasons that cut to the heart of what marriage was supposed to be. Consent, faithfulness, the ability to consummate, and for reasons born as much from spiritual ties as from the bodies and actions of those involved. Don't even think about having a wedding during Lent or Advent. Those were sacrosanct seasons when marriages were simply not allowed. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 added another layer. Bans, public proclamations meant to uncover hidden impediments before a couple could be joined. Religion reached into the smallest details of courtship and turned marriage into something that followed the church's calendar and its rules, shaping family life across towns and villages. Marrying was not a private, impulsive act. It began with ritual and scrutiny. A parish bell marked each stage, its tolling threading the weeks between promise and ceremony. A slow looping ink in a parish register waited to record the vow, and a priest stood between the lovers and the wider world, his presence enough to still the most impetuous heart. Vows spoken in private did not release a couple from the church's attention. Instead, questions were asked, aloud and in confidence, about births, previous relationships, and promises made to others. Those answers were weighed as carefully as any dowry, the truth of a lineage or a past pledge treated with the same gravity as property or title. Public announcements turned engagement into a matter of communal notice. On Sundays, a name might be read from the pulpit, a small parade of words meant to give neighbors a chance to speak if something untoward lurked in a family's past. Clergy probed degrees of kinship and past unions, and sometimes whole families were summoned to explain themselves. Where once there had been only affection, disputes over standing or inheritance surfaced, sharp as a quarrel over land. Picture the hush of the vestry room, the priest's ledger open, ink-stained fingers turning pages, the scratch of quill on paper, all part of the same ceremony. To be turned away, told to wait, to seek a dispensation, or to answer for some long-forgotten bond tested the resolve of those who wanted to marry and often hardened the heart. Because of this, ceremonies arrived after waiting and work, rather than as sudden flames of passion. Lovers learned patience in shadowed aisles, and families learned that obedience to the church could demand sacrifice. The solemnity of these rituals taught people that marriage was as much a community concern as a private joy. Every proclamation, every recorded promise, was a way of saying that the union belonged not only to two people, but to a whole parish that would live with it, judge it, and sometimes, in moments of crisis, save it. The church turned the simple act of marrying into a process of tests and witnesses, paperwork and penitence, a journey that required more than a quick "I do." Those who persisted emerged with something steadier than a secret hope, a bond acknowledged, recorded, and carried forward under watchful eyes. Everyone loves a good love story, and in the Middle Ages, that hunger for feeling took on a peculiar, unmistakable shape. Picture stone keeps and torchlit halls, cold wind pressing along a long road, while banners snap above a busy market square. Romance was not only a private feeling then, it was a performance, a language, a set of gestures people read as easily as a herald's colors. They called it courtly love, a code of speech and ceremony in which knights could pledge their hearts as publicly as they pledged their swords. Imagine a young knight on horseback, his armor dulled by travel, pausing beneath a high window where a lady sits framed by candlelight and embroidered curtains. He lowers his eyes, lifts his falconing hand in salute, and offers a vow, soft, solemn, to seek honor not through theft or boast, but through deeds done in her name. The quest becomes emblematic. Lists and tournaments, moonlit hunts, clever riddles, and penned verses, a small drama played out against the hard scaffolding of everyday obligations. Troubadours sang of the purity of devotion and the sweet ache of longing, insisting that love could ennoble a man and test his courage. Yet that ideal brushed up hard against a more practical world. Lords arranged marriages to secure land and strengthen alliances. Household ledgers and the demands of fealty tugged at the same men whose hearts were given away in poetry. A knight might be expected to defend his lord, collect rents, hold a manor court, or march to war, all while his thoughts clung to a distant image of the beloved. Courtly love often existed in words and ritual, public declarations, tokens exchanged in secrecy, while the world beyond the castle gate required bargaining, duty, and plain survival. That friction is what gives the stories their texture, the ceremony of a vow, and the hush of a minstrel's song, set against the knowledge that behind every polished phrase there were barns to be mended, accounts to be balanced, and the constant clatter of real life. Romance did not erase the practical. It altered the way people described desire, turning ache and longing into a code of honor, and making passion itself a crafted art. In those flickering, complicated scenes, passion and pragmatism met and reshaped each other. The result is the enduring, strange image of the medieval lover, half poet, half steward, an ideal at once sentimental and sensible, equal parts poetry and purpose. But let's face it, medieval marriage was more about practical unions than romantic destiny. Picture a match arranged by families who see a wedding as a shift in power, not a declaration of passion. The bride and groom, often strangers to each other, are brought together to serve a strategy that spans generations. Talk about a plot twist. Now imagine a great hall warmed by firelight, banners heavy from wooden beams, and the low hum of voices drifting over the clatter of cups and the scrape of knives. In a corner, a troubadour plucks a lute and sings of impossible devotion, of a knight who rides through storms and danger not for land or title, but for the approval of a lady he has hardly allowed himself to speak to. This is courtly love, a medieval romantic movie with grand gestures and languid longing, where poems and tournaments become stages for honor and desire. The language is florid, feelings are amplified by music and ritual, and admiration becomes an art practiced with rules and reverence. Knights polish armor and rehearse courteous speech as if preparing for a role, while women answer in careful smiles and tokens, their glances loaded with meaning. It's seductive and distant, a world where longing is an ornament. But step outside that glow and into the cold light of day, and a different reality awaits. Most marriages were negotiated in parlors and council rooms, over maps and ledgers rather than sonnets. They functioned like contracts, alliances forged to secure borders, expand holdings, and cement political ties. Fathers and mothers measured prospects by how they would shift power, bind estates, or strengthen trade. Dowries and inheritances circulated like currency. A marriage could be counted on balance sheets as much as in household roles. The emphasis fell on calculation and advantage, who would stand beside whom, and how names and lands might be entwined for generations. Beneath both the candlelit romance and the practical deal lay an often unspoken truth. Marriage was fundamentally about legacy. Lineage mattered more than sentiment. Families thought in terms of succession and obligation, of making sure a name and estate traveled forward through children and kin. The rituals of marriage, ceremony, vows, witnesses, took on the weight of continuity. Children were not simply the product of love. They were living assurances that a family's place in the social order would be secured. Status and duty sat at the heart of every household arrangement, shaping daily life and the choices of men and women alike, and yet hearts still stirred within those pragmatic contracts. Arranged marriages have been called the love stories you did not choose, and while they began for reasons other than attraction, feeling was rarely absent. Many people adapted, learned one another's rhythms, and over time found companionship in the lives they were given. Quiet routines, shared labor, and the accumulation of small kindnesses could slowly turn obligation into affection. Romance did not always die. It was reshaped by duty, sometimes surfacing in the margins where two lives were built together by work and time. So in the medieval world, romance and duty lived side by side. The lofty poetry of courtly love and the sober calculus of alliances were both part of the same tapestry, threads of longing and obligation woven tightly together. Whether in castle or cottage, people navigated the pull between desire and responsibility, creating human stories that are at once poetic and profoundly practical. Imagine being trapped inside a marriage that will not let you go, a bond treated as permanent by law, by God, and by everyone around you. Picture a narrow village lane frozen in winter, smoke curling from thatch, the breath of people hanging white in the air. At the center stands a small stone church. Its bells mark the hours, and its shadow touches every household. In the Middle Ages, that church was more than a house of worship. It was the arbiter of intimate fate, the place where personal joy and private sorrow became public business. Marriage was understood as a sacred, indissoluble covenant. To try to break it was to challenge the order that held a community together. There was no quick court filing, no private, painless way to untie vows and begin again. The only route that might free someone was to persuade church courts that, in the eyes of canon law, a true marriage had never existed. That path was slow and public. Intimate details were pulled into the open, reputations were weighed, and private pain became material for legal testimony. Winning such a case meant proving very specific faults. One could argue that the couple were too closely related, that one had already been bound by religious vows, that consent had been absent, that the marriage had never been consummated, or that some grave impediment made the union invalid from the start. Those phrases feel technical on the page, but in life they translated into vivid, often brutal realities. A confession that the marriage was never consummated might have to be delivered under oath. Kinship could be traced through family stories and elders who remembered connections across generations. Hearings were humiliating. Neighbors and relatives called to stand and speak, every whispered quarrel and old suspicion becoming evidence. The need to prove nullity rather than simply dissolve the marriage meant many endured scandal and years of uncertainty to escape. The process exposed not only couples, but entire households. Marriages were not merely private contracts of the heart. They were tools of alliance and economy. Dowries, land, inheritance, and the future of children were all tangled up with the marital tie. Families, especially among the aristocracy, used that power. Objections could be staged or supported when it served their interests. For ordinary people, the stakes were no less real. A woman without the protection of a husband risked losing social standing and material support. A man risked challenges to his heir's legitimacy and disruptions in the flow of property. Power could bend the rules. Wealth and influence sometimes bought papal dispensations or episcopal decisions that effectively ended unions at the highest levels of society. Those exceptions only highlighted the rule. For the vast majority, marriage was effectively a permanent state. The social and religious machinery, the slow grind of ecclesiastical justice, community expectations, and theological doctrine made leaving painful, expensive, and rare. That is the hard truth of the medieval world. Being stuck in a marriage was not just a private sorrow, but a public, legal condition shaped by theology, custom, and the slow, deliberate work of church courts. Annulment was the safest route, but the reasons had to be rock solid. Consanguinity, leprosy, impotence, or prior religious vows. Domestic violence, shocking as it was, simply didn't count. More often than not, the case climbed all the way to Rome, and the Pope would have to step in. That turned a private grief into a public, drawn-out ordeal, full of petitions, witnesses, and the slow machinery of church law. Marriage itself behaved less like a fragile promise, and more like something poured and hardened in an instant. Once two people were joined in the sight of God and the community, that bond held fast. It wouldn't loosen for a whispered regret or a sudden change of heart. To break it, you had to do more than claim freedom. You had to prove, openly and painfully, that the knot had been tied under false pretenses, that some weight of truth could undo what everyone assumed was settled. Even the church calendar set its own timetable for love and law. In seasons like Lent and Advent, weddings and dissolutions were set aside. Vows and their undoing were thought inappropriate amid fasting and penitential silence. Decisions waited for the liturgical clock to permit action, and people found themselves stalled by holy days and customs as surely as by law. Picture a young couple with their finery packed away while candles gutter in an empty parish hall, or an aggrieved partner clutching paper proof of betrayal and pacing the echoing corridors of church life until the time allowed them to speak. Lives were lived in limbo, every relationship layered with the gravity of custom, faith, and the public eye, intimacies bound by religious authority and rules that made disentanglement a slow, exacting business. If you misunderstood your marriage status, it could lead to serious legal headaches. Ending a union in that world was no simple thing. Getting out of one could be a Herculean task that required patience, persistence, and a lot of paperwork. So when a marriage began, everyone treated it as something that needed careful tending from the very start. Getting married in the Middle Ages rarely began with moonlit promises or secret notes. More often, it began around a heavy wooden table under watchful eyes. Fathers and mothers, uncles and stewards arrayed like a judging court. Picture a great hall with oak beams darkened by smoke, tapestries stitched with long histories, and a line of faces there for calculation rather than romance. Vows were worked out not just between two people, but between two households, a way to stitch together land and livestock, legal claims and old debts, future children, and present influence. There was a ritual to that bargaining. A ledger of expectations could be opened, inked promises read aloud, dowries offered, inspected, and negotiated. Goods and money were counted to secure the new household and bind families into mutual obligation. Fathers spoke in measured tones about property and protection. Mothers, sometimes with a steely kindness, reminded everyone of lineage and reputation. Hands were clasped across benches as if sealing a treaty, and those handshakes carried real weight. Alliances were quietly struck that might shift the balance of power across a valley or steady relations between rival clans. To be the child at the center of such bargaining was to be both prized and pawn, loved perhaps in private, expected in public. Then there was the church, solemn and central to making the arrangement official. Clergy brought order, a public ceremony, prayers muttered in candlelight. The community gathered to witness what had already been negotiated. The priest's words gave the union spiritual standing. The rite folded political purpose into sacrament and laid down both rights and obligations. There were rules to be observed. Who could marry whom? How disputes might be settled, what vows meant in law as well as in faith. The ceremony turned the practical into the sacred, and that sanctity mattered legally and socially. Love, when it came, was often an aftergift. Tenderness sometimes grew over years of shared labor and daily life. For some couples, affection deepened into real companionship. For others, love remained a hope that the signatures and prayers didn't guarantee. The fairy tale happily ever after wasn't the point for most people. Survival, continuity, and honor were more urgent aims in a world where resources and reputation could mean the difference between thriving and merely getting by. Still, those medieval unions left traces that live on. The way neighbors gathered, the bells that called the community, the feast that marked a new bond. These became threads woven into later wedding customs. When you see a procession, a signed certificate, or the careful exchange of promises today, you can hear faint echoes of those hall-side negotiations and churchly ceremonies. The marriage of the Middle Ages was rougher and more pragmatic than our romantic ideal, but it was also deeply communal. And in that honest, necessary way, it helped shape the weddings we know now.